Okay, I'll be doing a motion breakdown of the motions for round three of Guangzhou Australs, which are that states which have recently formed through religious secession should establish religious councils rather than implementing secularism, that we support states employing surrendered militants for counterinsurgency measures, and that the Indian feminist movement should actively encourage women to participate in the AWGMDC scheme. So I'm going to start by talking about how I do motion selection, and then I'll do a motion breakdown for one of the topics. So basically for motion selection, I think if I were on affirmative, my instinct would be to prefer motion two and to veto motion three. To explain that instinct, I think basically motion two, surrendered militants are likely to have the potential to be highly useful to counterinsurgency measures. Like they have a lot of information that would be useful. You can understand the inner workings of the insurgency better. And I think that affirmative can reasonably argue that states have a fair bit of discretion and ability to be strategic over how they use surrendered militants, which means that I think this is probably a good affirmative. And I think that the third motion about the Indian feminist movement, I would probably veto. I tend to think motions about feminists supporting kind of conscription type things are a little bit neg-weighted insofar as the feminist movement has probably limited political capital, lots of things they could be advocating on. And I think that this is one that might be sometimes good for women, but is kind of dubiously so, or is not in every instance, which means I think probably not my favorite affirmative. Then I think if I was on neg, I'd obviously do the reverse of that. So that means I think that hopefully I'd end up debating motion one about state secularism. So that's the motion that I'm going to be breaking down. I'll start with affirmative and talk through how I'd go about the affirmative on this topic. I think basically I'd begin with a bit of setup. I think I'd say religious secession often happens because of oppression under the state that you seceded from. For instance, that they forbade you from exercising your religion, and that's usually the kind of thing that produces enough backlash in order to have a successful secession. Um, then I think I would suggest that religious councils are likely to be quite popular and quite reasonable. I think this is important preemptive material. I would say that that is true, firstly, because they're the majority religion, hence rather popular. Secondly, that they have incentives to have a good relationship with the government. They want it to be a working relationship. They want the government to take their advice, which means they're likely to be pretty reasonable. Thirdly, I think then I'd say they're also not likely to be kind of coercive or majoritarian because they are. Firstly, you've just been freed from religious oppression. You're probably kind of oriented around celebrating and practicing your religion rather than necessarily coercing other people to. But additionally, like you have recent experiences of religious coercion or religious oppression, probably have a desire for peace. That means I think religious councils are likely to support a model of religious state which is relatively pluralist. Then I'd finally say neg probably has to defend constitutional secularism, having no official state religion, having a ban on making explicitly religious laws, things like that. So that's what I'd say in setup. Then I'd have two kind of key arguments. Firstly, why this is good for national identity. I think the weighing here is essentially like you're coming out of a period of crisis or violence or conflict. And that means it's extremely important to have a strong national identity that makes people want to engage in the state and feel attached to the state. You're a fledgling nation, and so it's important to have that kind of sense of identity for stability reasons. I think you can explain this on two levels. I think firstly, you can suggest that this is kind of principally good. You can say people have a principled right to practice their religion and to self-determination. It's important to a lot of people that the laws in their country reflect their religious values, and that they feel their state is an ethical one. This is incredibly central to their identity. It's something which is necessary for democratic legitimacy and for them to believe in the state that has just formed. And so on a principled level, we might believe that the state should be a religious one. But secondly, I think you can say this is important for people to feel investment in the state and to want to, for instance, pay taxes and participate in civic institutions and things like that. And basically, I think here you just say people obviously conceive of this as a religious state. You know, they've probably fought and died in many instances for their religion in order to establish this state. And that means that people feel it's far more worth it where they can see their religious identity reflected and celebrated. And that obviously has a variety of practical benefits attached to it, as I already mentioned. So I think that's probably the first affirmative argument. I think the second affirmative argument is why this is good for stability. I think basically the reasoning for this is Firstly, it reduces the incentive for religions kind of meddling or intervening in politics in other and more perverse ways. This provides them with a clear mechanism that they can use to exert their influence. It's public, it's visible, it's accountable, which I think potentially absorbs religious extremism and means that it's less likely, extremist political parties or extremist movements emerge. So I think it's important to kind of signal respect for religion in order to make people feel that their religion is kind of seen and listened to, and prevent that kind of feeling that it's being suppressed for making it more extreme. Secondly, then I think you can say comparatively, secularism is less likely to be respected. And that's essentially because people conceive of the state as being a religious state. They view their religion as being extremely important and central to their identity, which means that a state can signal that it wants to be secular, but that might not necessarily work or persuade people that they should respect other religions, or that they should obey secular laws and things like that. I think finally you can just impact this by saying, in the long run, having a kind of pressure valve by which you can mediate religious sentiment and include religious sentiment in your national identity and in your laws in a reasonable and public and accountable way prevents things like backlashing against religious minorities, prevents things like extremism or politics becoming extremely, extremely religious. And so this is broadly something which is good for stability. You produce a kind of stable religious state, and that kind of allows you to access long-term benefits. So I think is the affirmative. Neg, I think basically I'd make three arguments. Firstly, I'd say religious councils are likely to be kind of interventionist and coercive. Uh, then I'd say this makes national identity worse, and then I'd say secularism gets more international support. On the first one about religious councils being interventionist, basically here I'd be like, number one, this is a religious imperative to do so. Like we're talking about senior religious figures who obviously feel strongly about their religion, feel metaphysically strongly about their religion. It seems like they would be pretty keen to make their mark on the laws of the country. Secondly, they are obviously the majority religion, which means they have a lot of support. And I think then you can characterize that it's quite easy for them to coerce the government. Like it's highly public when they don't follow your recommendations. You're clearly able to mobilize people to oppose the government if they don't listen to you. And I think the harm here is essentially that you have this factor in your national government that kind of permanently undermines democracy. You have these unelected councils who have the ability to place a pretty high degree of religious pressure on your laws, and where it could be destabilizing if politicians ignore them. And obviously that might be fine in the short term to the extent that people are religious and want laws to be religious, but it's perhaps insufficiently flexible. It doesn't reflect changes in national opinion, and it is kind of unjust for people who might be minorities in that state and might want to express their views via democracy, but get stopped from doing so by virtue of these religious councils. So basically, I think a kind of counter-characterization of how these religious councils likely operate coming from the neg. The next thing, why this makes national identity worse, I think basically here I'd claim, even if being pluralist and being secular is difficult, and maybe goes against people's initial conception of the state, it is worth it. It's something that makes minorities feel more welcome. They feel like they're a part of the state and they can fully participate in, state institutions and in state life. And I think that that is something which is good because it means those people are less likely to backlash against the state, less likely to leave the state. It leads to more stability. Secondly, I think having a secular national identity is good because it allows for more change over time. A lot of states do become less religious over time. People do become less secular, become more secular rather. And I think having the ability for states to reflect people's changing religious identity is probably a good thing. But thirdly, I just say that I think in the absence of an explicitly religious identity, it's likely that a state develops other and potentially more productive national identities and aspirations. Things like, for instance, being an economic powerhouse, or things like, for instance, celebrating shared culture, like, ethnic culture rather than religious culture. And I think that that is something which might be more generative, might produce more unity, might be, broadly more productive and less divisive. So I think you can say, actually, it is probably a good thing to be secular. And it is then possible because people can recognize these benefits, even though they might really, want to have been freed from the state where they previously were. And that's often because they want to practice their religion and they care about their religion. It is not necessarily motivated by a desire to impose that religion on others or to live in an explicitly religious state. Finally, then, I think you can make the argument that secularism gets more international support. Basically, I think the claim here is like relationships with other countries are particularly important, especially when you're a fledgling state. You need things like trade relationships and alliances and so on. The country that you seceded from is potentially not delighted with you. And so I think that it is important that you have international legitimacy and you're taken seriously as a country. And I think that you can say secularism is a good path to that. It signals your desire to be pluralist, that you're not going to be particularly divisive or authoritarian, that you're not going to be punitive to religious minorities. And I think that that's something that a lot of other countries are likely to respect. It's probably something that helps you form bonds with countries who don't share the same religion of you as you. And I think generally that's a signaling effect that makes it easier to form international relationships. Potentially, it also helps you build a relationship with the state that you seceded from, although I think that's maybe less important because it's a bit more speculative. But yeah, basically, that's how I would see this debate going down. So I think kind of a characterization clash about the likely character of these kind of religious councils, how interventionist they want to be in politics. Then a clash about how desirable a religious identity is for these states. And then a clash about the kind of material effects on the formation and stability of that country. Cool. Hope that helps.